Okay, the bell strikes, so I think we will just begin. My name is Stein Sundsel-Eriksen. I'm a senior researcher here at NUPI, and I'll be chairing and leading this seminar. This is one of a series of seminars that NUPI has held about the developments in Ukraine and various aspects of it. And for today's seminar, we are very pleased to have Volodymyr Ishchenko from Freie University in Berlin with us. Before I forget, I should mention to you all that this event is being streamed, so it will be on YouTube or something after we finish. The plan for the seminar is as follows. I give a brief introduction here first. Then Jørn Holm Hansen, senior researcher and Russia-Ukraine specialist at Oslo Met University, will say a few words. Then we move on and keep the rest of the seminar as a more of a dialogue and discussion. First between the three of us, and then towards the end with questions or comments from the audience. I'll start. The background for having this seminar is that Western European and Norwegian debates about the Ukraine have focused mainly on the aggression of Russia, the policies of NATO, and in general about external actors' role in driving the conflict. What we have had much less focus on in the Norwegian debate is political dynamics internally within Ukraine. And that's what we want to focus on today. And the discussion will mainly be based on Volodymyr's book, Towards the Abyss, which came out last year, which is a collection of articles written over a period of several years, which analyzes the internal political dynamics in Ukraine. His approach differs from what we get presented as the picture of Ukrainian politics, which is that of a unified nation fighting the external aggressor, with much less focus on internal conflicts and dynamics and political cleavages. But these do exist, as Volodymyr described very well in his different books, articles. His analysis will not be contested or controversial, but they give a different angle to what we are used to seeing, and which we feel will be a very valuable addition or contribution to knowledge about Ukraine within Norway. So before we start asking the actual dialogue, I'll ask Jørn to say a few words.
Okay, thank you, Stein. Thank you for having me here. I think one of the things I like, there are a lot of things I really like about Ukraine, and one of the things is Ukraine's pluralism and diversity. And for many reasons, and one of the reasons is that this pluralism and diversity makes Ukraine, in a way, ready for Europe. If we think of what different ideological, authoritarian ideologies claim about diversity and pluralism, they reject it, especially the many Russian varieties of authoritarianism. That's why they do not like what they call European civilization, because we live with conflicts, we take conflict seriously, we listen to each other, we have different views. we cope with conflicts of interest in Europe. And just like any other country, also in peacetime, Ukraine has got problems, internal problems. These are made use of by the Putinist propaganda, but not all these problems are just imagination from his point of view. All kind of disinformation and propaganda, if it's sufficient, takes as its point of departures some grains of truth. And I think it would be very dangerous if we do not acknowledge that there are some internal problems in Ukraine, some things that should be discussed. We should not succumb to this authoritarian idea of idiocracy, that there is only one idea that is allowed at the time. This is a very Russian style of thinking, under Tsarism, under communism, and after. So that's why I think this meeting where Volodymyr, who is a kind of heterodox analyst of Ukrainian politics, gets the floor. I think this is particularly important for Norway. Norway is going to, and already is giving, loads of billions of Norwegian kroner to the reconstruction of Ukraine. And we know from many other cases of programs for post-conflict reconstruction that wishful thinking and smoothing things out, sweeping things under the carpet, is dangerous. It leads to failure. So that's why I think it leads to failure, and I think Ukraine cannot afford to fail this time. That's why I think Volodymyr's critical views on Ukraine's domestic politics, we do not need necessarily to agree on, should be welcomed. And I really thank Stein and Nupi for arranging this seminar. Thank you.
I would like to start by referring to the introduction to Volodymyr's book, Towards the Abyss. The heading of that introduction is The Wrong Ukrainian. A wrong Ukrainian, referring to himself. Now, I think it's a good point of starting the discussion is to ask you to explain what do you mean by that? What is a wrong Ukrainian, and by contrast, what is a right Ukrainian?
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this event and inviting me to Nupi. Very, very honored by this, and for the ability to discuss my books and analysis about Ukraine. So, speaking about the wrong Ukrainian, that's a bit of kind of like a reaction to how the discussion of Ukraine, especially in the international sphere, has developed, and especially after the start of the full-scale invasion, but even before that, when specific positions, specific views were kind of like framed as not legitimate for Ukrainian political sphere, even though, well, those views have been actually present in Ukrainian politics, in Ukrainian society. They had their own dynamics, sometimes more popular, sometimes less popular. They're changing right now as well as a result of the dynamics of the war and understanding of what is possible and what is not possible to win in this war. And they are present in Ukraine. However, it's in certain intellectual, academic, public circles, it kind of like becomes difficult. It's one way to say it. Well, the positions, for example, for Ukraine's neutrality, right? So for Ukraine being a bilingual state, for Ukraine retaining the Soviet Ukrainian legacy, right? So these positions which I think are important, and I would defend them. They are, well, they are voiced typically by the Westerners, but at the same time, it's difficult to voice them as a Ukrainian, even though they are actually present in the Ukrainian society. And well, let me start from the immediate disagreement. Even in your introductions, right, you make a lot of like justifications. We should not necessarily agree with him, right? So his views are not necessarily uncontroversial, right? In discussion with other Ukrainians, right, you are not making this kind of like immediate justifications that, well, although, well, Ukrainians are different, and Ukrainians have different positions, right? And not everything that we can agree on. But it's just about this specific kind of views, we actually need to start defending that, well, this has to be, this must have a place, right? So let him speak, and so on and so forth. Around Ukrainian, it's kind of like, well, a way to describe the situation. Can I speak as a Ukrainian, but at the same time, kind of like having wrong views in the views of, well, some people, some Ukrainians and some Westerners. And especially within the international public. And so that's the preface to the book, which is quite long, well, describes basically my biography, my family's biography, how my parents and the grandparents were during the Soviet Union were rising from workers and peasants to intellectuals, intelligentsia, working on the very advanced technical projects. And this was the process of modernization in which our family was also participating, as many other Ukrainians as well. Working on the cybernetics, we were working on the space industry in particular, as my father did. And at the same time, yes, they were switching from Ukrainian to Russian language. And for them, this was not the language of oppression, this was the language of social advancement. That's, well, very clearly and subjectively they feel so. And then, is it possible to defend this, right? So, is it possible to voice this background and to say that, yes, this was normal, this was progressive, this was progress, and we participated in this social progress within the Soviet Ukraine. That state which, well, ceased to exist in 1991, however, it left enormous political, material, cultural legacy for the post-Soviet Ukraine, which, well, especially after the start of the full-scale invasion, but even before that, after Euro-Maidan, have been started to be delegitimated, destroyed, cancelled, and so on and so forth. Criminalized in particular, speaking about certain, well, pro-Soviet views on Ukrainian history. And that's something that I wanted to tell and wanted to share. Right? Also from my own personal view and personal history. And then it's also the question of the, again, another criticism immediately of the framing of this event as a counter voice. This is something that I am actually very much critical about, also in the book, which includes the chapter on Ukrainian voices. The people who, well, who use the identity to push forward specific ideas. It's and for the Western elites also instrumentalizing supposedly the voices speaking supposedly for the whole Ukrainian people, while actually representing typically only a very specific group within Ukrainian society, which is a complex, modern, diverse society. Right? So to address this problem is not to speak as a kind of like a counter voice and to present myself as a, well, speaking for the, well, proper Ukraine or like their own Ukraine or whatever. But actually to challenge this whole idea about the voices. We need to not to listen to the voices, but to listen to the arguments. Mm-hmm. And that is what is important. That is what makes the basis for a rational discussion about Ukraine and about the world. And even more so, it is important to speak, to be valued not simply as Ukrainians, as well, just inheriting this identity, inheriting citizenship and so on, but to be valued for what we can contribute to the world. And this is very important because, well, after the start of the full-scale invasion, this was clear from the very start that when the international conjuncture is going to change, we are not going to be needed by the Western elites. And this is exactly what happened in 2025 after Trump's victory. The international alignment is changing, and what we are getting, the very important, powerful groups of the most powerful state in the world are not interested in Ukraine as such. And that's a question to us, whether we should continue to mobilize Ukrainian voices, or rather think about what Ukraine can contribute to the universal discussions, to the universal interests, and to think about the global problems through the prism of Ukraine.
I think that's a very interesting point to bring up there towards the end. But I'd like to use this as a starting point to what you say, that this presentation of Ukraine as a unified country where people, where pluralism and opposition is kind of suppressed. What does that reveal about the nature of ideological foundation of the Ukrainian state today, and what kind of what does it suppress in terms of conflict, say, between Russians and Ukrainians, East and West, working classes and oligarchs?
It's not that pluralism is necessarily suppressed, although certain specific views and positions are indeed criminalized, and there are cases when the people are actually get real court trials for liking something on the social networks, something like pro-Soviet. Human rights organization, for example, found, like, I think in 2024, 700 of such criminal cases. Basically, the people are saying something wrong online, or even in the private conversations. But it's even deeper. At least this is a problem of the many discussions about Ukraine. That the pluralism is not simply suppressed. It is not even meant to exist. That's a problem, and that's a whole discussion about the unity. Well, we could be united in the rejection of the imposition of Russian rule. But then what? How much of that unity is actually about not simply rejecting Russia, but for uniting about something positive? And which social group, which political agent can actually propose and lead the country for some positive development, which at least basically in the whole history of the post-Soviet Ukraine, it has never actually existed. And this is a part of the problem with, not just with Ukrainian politics, but with the whole post-Soviet politics. Russia has own problems about that, and the development of authoritarianism in Russia is in particular about this incapacity to unite the country about the positive hegemonic agenda. But nowadays, we also see the development of, at least in certain ways, similar processes in many other countries in the world. The crisis of political representation, which is felt in many European countries. That's why populist movements, that's why these anti-establishment parties, that's why the attempts to ban their own parties or push them out of the politics has been actually happening more and more in the European Union, which has been presented for us, for Ukrainians as well, the European values and the democratic ideal. in the United States, and not speaking about other parts of the world, it's point to some fundamental process of erosion of liberal democracy. And Ukraine, in this perspective, may be showing some of those processes developing far enough to more extreme extent, and in a certain way as a magnifying glass for the world. As a, as an example, when those processes may develop up to critical point. So that's about pluralism and unity. Unity around what exactly? Not simply against something. And that unity also should presuppose certain pluralism that allows to develop a more substantial positive unity in a rational discussion, which has been deteriorating not just in Ukraine and because of the understandable reasons, but, well, in many other parts of the world which are not in the situation of the full-scale war.
I think you mentioned Ukraine as a prism for the future developments in Europe. And you write about this kind of alliance between nationalists and liberalists, which I see Ukraine as an interesting case of not only an alliance between nationalist and liberalist groups. We have seen that before. And we have seen liberals becoming nationalists, like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Jörg Haider in Austria, and alliances between liberal and nationalist parties. But in Ukraine, it seems that these alliances internalized on an individual level. You speak to some NGO activists and so on, they are both cosmopolitan and ethno-nationalist at the same time. And in Europe, in Ukraine, that's a few of them slip of the tongue. Second time I confuse Europe with Ukraine. That's good. In Ukraine, you have pro-Europeans who are radically ethno-nationalists at the same time. So you have pro-Europeanness without European values. And as you have written somewhere in eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, you have quite conservative ways of thinking among those, the former parties that people tended to vote for there, financed and funded by oligarchs or political capitalists, as you call them. They were quite conservative. There was a kind of national conservatism without a nation. So you have pure pro-Europeanness without European values, and you have national conservatism without the nation, ethnic nation. That's interesting. So my question then is, will this kind of national liberal alliance survive further European integration of Ukraine? And before I thought that this was going to not to happen. It will be a kind of wake-up call. You get ultra-nationalists or strongly nationalists or only nationalist groups into Europe, which Europe has struggled with already. Hungary, Poland, for instance. That will become a problem. And then my kind of pessimistic view or dystopian view is that isn't this what is already happening in Europe? That the far right is more and more incorporated and accepted in our system. But anyway, my question is, will the National Liberal Alliance survive further EU integration of Ukraine?
I mean, there are many questions and many assumptions behind it, right? So starting from the further European integration of Ukraine, to which extent is it actually going to happen? Yes, there are processes, and Ukraine is now closer to EU than ever before, but at the same time, the integration into that European Union as we knew and which existed in the last decades is also not without challenge and not without provoking a lot of dissent and conflict within EU itself. Between the countries, well, Hungary and I think Slovakia kind of like adamant now against Ukraine. And this also gets to the material conflicts. Well, Poland may also be against, in particular, about because of the agriculture. But also, well, within the countries, right, there might be very strong opposition into accepting Ukraine into the EU. In Germany, in France, and that's developed. It depends a lot about the development of the European politics itself, right? And then that alliance that emerged in Ukraine between, well, pro-Western cosmopolitan liberals organized in the typically in the NGOs and the, well, kind of like civil society around them, or at least they present themselves as a Ukrainian civil society. And the ethno-nationalists, the far right, at least in the Eastern European context, is indeed kind of like, looks like as a kind of like a puzzle, something unusual, at least in the, well, in the recent years, we've seen the similar camps in Poland, in Hungary, in Slovakia. In certain way, we may also speak about Russia and some other Soviet states, Georgia in particular. So these camps were separated, and they were actually forming the main, well, political cleavage in the countries. In Ukraine, that was different. Well, Ukrainian nationalists were kind of like on the side of the pro-Western, pro-European forces. And serving as a kind of like radical flank, capable for violence, capable for street politics, actually building some ideological parties, which most political agents in Ukraine were not that good about, integrating the army and so on and so forth. So that's speaking about Azov in particular. And on the other side, well, the oligarchs that were pushing sometimes a bit kind of like Orbanite politics, conservatism, anti-Soros, anti-globalism, criticizing what they called external management, especially after Euro-Maidan, and referring to the growing influence of NGOs, of the Western powers on the construction of the Ukrainian politics after Euro-Maidan and now. But at the same time, not capable to organize themselves around some national project. And that's well, one of the most important contradictions in Ukrainian politics that goes to the roots of the development of the post-Soviet class conflict between well, what I call political capitalists as the dominant fraction of the post-Soviet ruling class, the capitalists whose major competitive advantage are their selective benefits from the state, and that's why they are capable to acquire their wealth, especially in the process of the Soviet disintegration, and who rely mainly on the passive support from the working classes working at the old Soviet factories, in particular pensioners. And on the other side, the professional middle classes who are excluded from the political capitalism, who are becoming kind of like allied with transnational capital. And in the specific Ukrainian situation, this conflict was politically articulated in kind of like weird alliance where the well, radical nationalists were aligning more with the pro-Western transnational camp, while the other side were not capable to develop their own kind of like radical wing, or at least they actually had it in the form of the Communist Party and some other more marginal left-wing parties, but they had a very kind of like different dynamics. Radical nationalists were growing in their power and in their legitimacy, while the communists were, well, basically degrading, and since 2014 they've been repressed. So what is going to happen after the war or with the European integration is basically it's a space for speculations. On the one hand, it's a question how well Western liberalism is going to develop, and whether it is not in crisis itself, Those connections to the far right are actually some of the signs that the Western liberalism is basically losing the basis of its support, and it has to move towards more populist, towards more nationalist and also repressive agendas. And on the other hand, it's also the question of the Ukrainian nationalist side of this alliance, whether, to the extent they're becoming more powerful, they are starting to develop their own politics and push forward their own agenda, not actually needing those Western groups to legitimate themselves, because they have become legitimated as veterans, as heroes of the war, and well, under certain scenarios of the end of the war, they may actually become an autonomous and popular, powerful political force, appealing to the veterans, appealing to the people who would feel grievances about the end of the war and probably loss of the territories. And in this context, they have a political future. And we also have a very example of Viktor Orban himself in Hungary, starting as basically as a dissident, pro-democratic, pro-Western politician in the early 90s, and then moving to something like convergent with Putin in a certain way.
I would like to follow up a bit on what you said earlier about the inability of the Ukrainian regime to formulate a positive program or vision rather beyond just being against, say, the Russian invasion. Now, in your book, you describe the situation in Ukraine as a crisis of hegemony, by which you mean, I guess, the lack of any unifying social vision for the political direction of the country. Now, why do you think that it has not been possible to create a social bloc that could aspire to, or perhaps become, hegemonic and formulate a political vision for a future Ukraine? Of course, it's always difficult. You talked about the lack of unity within Ukraine and its pluralism. But then you also talked about the class structure and the class conflict, and the unifying attempts to create a national identity which ends up being actually exclusive. So this cultural nationalist project of creating hegemony cannot succeed, as I understand you. So what then is conceivable as an alternative social foundation of a hegemonic bloc or a political project?
Nationalism has been an important factor of building hegemonies of the ruling class historically. But it has never been just about nationalism. It has been, at least in the understanding of this kind of like culturalist symbolic politics, as it is actually more or less about, in Ukraine right now, kind of like rejecting something that sounds pro-Russian or pro-Soviet, and at the same time, articulating Ukrainian, but in a purely symbolic way. That's all about this so-called decolonization right now. However, nationalism and also decolonization have been about building different kind of states historically, more inclusive, more integrative, also inclusive for the working classes. So they're becoming not just exploited workers, but also citizens, and they're kind of like starting to feel that they have actually some participation, some share in that state that they can defend. At the most expensive moment, it was the welfare state built after the Second World War, and especially in the Western Europe and Scandinavian countries were the peak development, perhaps, of that particular kind of capitalism, democratic in a very, substantial way, not simply allowing some universal suffrage. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's good.
but also providing material conditions for participation, for the feelings that at least most of the people has actually stake in the future of this country. That's something that has existed, but has been also under erosion and under attack for several decades right now. And at this moment, we are starting to feel this problem. And when we ask what are the roots about the crisis of hegemony in Ukraine or even in the broader post-Soviet world, the hegemony of the ruling class is now in crisis around the whole world. And at least in my view, the primary reason for that has to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which presented the strongest alternative to the rule of the bourgeoisie. And when that Soviet alternative became stagnating, eroding, then finally collapsing, and this is very much about also Ukrainian history and Ukrainian contribution to the Soviet Union, and then Ukrainian contribution to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We lose this threat of the social revolution. Probably the most important factor that pushed the ruling classes to rule in a responsible way, to be more integrative, inclusive for the as much of the societies as possible.
In the West.
In the West themselves, but also certain elements of that existed and expanded from many countries of the world. Although not to the whole extent, but still, yes, the West could present itself, and the European Union could present itself as as a progressive development, as something that many countries, or especially in the Eastern Europe, need to aspire for. That soft power of the European integration. Now it is eroding, and developments, in particular in Georgia, when with the recent attack on the pro-Western civil society, and in other post-Soviet countries, and very unstable results in Moldova recently, are showing that hegemony of the Western bourgeoisie is going down. We feel it on the international level. We also see it on the domestic level themselves, that people actually less and less see the stakes of themselves in the countries that are developed in this way. They feel less and less difference in the way how the elections, about the electoral results. Whoever they vote, the policies are going to be rather the same. And when the people like Trump come to power and actually start to rule at least a little bit differently, right, the whole world is in horror. So, speaking about the incapacity of the post-Soviet elites, in particular in Ukraine, to offer any hegemonic project, we need to look from the global perspective. In Ukraine, in particular because the crisis of hegemony in post-Soviet countries is specifically the crisis of the Soviet counter-hegemony to the capitalist rule, that crisis is felt to the most extreme extent. And this points to the pretty extreme developments in terms of the shallowness of the politics, in terms of the amount of instability, and those Maidan revolutions that have been happening in Ukraine, in 1990, 2004, and 2014, so 3 revolutions in the life of just one generation, which is something extraordinary, but also points to the scale of the destabilization of Ukrainian politics. That's one manifestation. On other manifestation is stronger and stronger authoritarian regimes, in particular in Russia, in particular in Belarus, in Central Asia, and developments in more or less the same direction, in Georgia, potentially in Moldova, potentially also in Ukraine under certain ways to how this war may end. So that's a problem. Nationalism should never be simply about symbols. It should be about material progressive development. And when it lacks, nationalism only contributes to more and more destabilization, to more and more of the crisis.
I guess this connects to what you write about what you call the post-Soviet vicious cycle and the incomplete revolutions, where governments or political regimes are thrown out, but no basic social change actually occurred. And you just end up having a new government coming in, promising great progress, and then after quite a short while, its legitimacy erodes because it cannot fulfill those expectations, and the cycle begins anew. Sometimes through revolutions, political revolutions, as you've seen in Ukraine. Other times just through changes of government, which don't really mean any substantive change of policy. But a paradox in all this is that in the midst of this story of, loss of the belief in progress, the narrative about Ukraine, at least in the West, is still, in the sense, historical, teleological, and that Ukraine, the problem with Ukraine is that it has not yet reached the level of the Western democratic state. So it must be assisted in order to be brought into true liberal capitalist modernity. And that narrative prevails even as the belief in that narrative in the West itself, as you say, is eroding. And that's a bit of a paradox, I think.
Well, I actually agree about that, and this is the tragedy. Just imagine, for example, the 1980s, right? The last days of the Soviet Union, and well, let's say in some African country, the Marxist-Leninist Party wins the revolution. Something like that was actually, it was pretty close in South Africa, in particular in the last days of the apartheid regime. And then these young communists, they invite Soviet comrades and say them about Marx, Lenin, and we need your help, we are fighting for the revolution. But Soviet communists are not interested in that anymore. Georgy Debelyan, he's like a famous Armenian sociologist. He's been particularly, and in the 1980s he was actually working as a translator in Mozambique and studying Mozambique partisans, pro-communists and also anti-communists. And he was describing that process when actually the Soviets were less and less interested, and they were trying to actually exit from all those international commitments. And it's something like the same happened in Ukraine since 2014, when, well, Ukrainians are waving EU flags at the same moment when EU is entering the bigger and bigger crisis. And there is little faith and hope in those European values in the Europe itself. And then, as a result, Ukraine gets into the abyss, while help from the West is deteriorating. That's a problem, and exactly that's the problem with this teleological narrative that Ukraine is not sufficiently Western. In certain ways, it's kind of like there are perhaps more people in Ukraine who still, or at least strongly believe in this narrative, and still tries to push Ukraine in that direction. But the problem is whether there are actual material conditions for that, and whether that kind of, well, hegemonic, attractive, soft power European Union still exists, or whether this is something that Europeans themselves want to change, or at least do not know how to prevent the change.
I think this wish to join Europe is not totally unfounded. If you take Ukraine and Poland in 1990, 1989, their economies were almost equally strong. Today, Poland's economy is 4 times bigger than Ukraine's economy. And this difference started long before Poland joined the European Union. So I think it's not only dreams. I think there is some, some substance in this wish. But I would like to pick up.
The question is whether that path is still available.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the part of the teleological pro-Western narrative that Ukraine needs to have, or maybe it had, its own 1989 movement. We had it in 2014 with Euro-Maidan. Euro-Maidan is delayed 1989, when finally we got rid of those post-Soviet elites, and we are aspiring. We decided, we made our civilizational choice, we are joining Europe now. But whether that Europe exists at all, whether it is even possible to repeat the Polish path, and whether, in fact, Ukraine is actually becoming periphery of Poland, in terms of the millions of Ukrainian refugees integrating the Polish economy, in terms of this disbalance of power and economic capacity between Poland, and especially after the full-scale war, Ukraine destroyed and, with a number of people who might need jobs, who might need to join their families in Poland. And so the question is, yes, we may actually get closer to Poland, but not exactly as equals of Poland, rather than some kind of periphery. Maybe of Poland, maybe of Germany, maybe of whatever is the other economic power in the EU.
You mentioned this exodus of Ukrainians from Ukraine started long before 2022 and also before 2014. Firstly, mainly to Russia, then after the European Union lifted the visa restrictions in 2017, more and more to Poland and Germany and the Czech Republic. So Ukraine is losing a lot of able-bodied citizens, people who are in the best of their ages where you work, get kids, pay taxes. How do you think that influence internal Ukrainian politics? We have seen from other countries that is something that kind of inspires some right-wing nationalism feeling of being, so to speak, emptied, and that your country, your society is kind of worth less because people just move out. Of course, the war and the aggression, Russian aggression, then there are reasons to other reasons than purely economic and so on, because it has to do with security. But still, it's a mixture, and people leave. And how do you think that will?
Depopulation is not simply a problem of nationalists. It's not simply the problem of the people who want to have a bigger country. We need future generations to pay for our pensions. If you are going to have less and less people, that would mean that the burden of the young, on our children, on their children, is going to be more and more. And that's why, there is actually the reason to invite more migration to, at least in Germany, this is the discussion right now. Last year, the United Nations forecasted the Ukrainian population by the end of the 21st century as 15 million. That was the median forecast. Of course, there are different scenarios. Of course, there are different factors that may intervene in the realization of this or that forecast. But that was the median forecast, something like in between. 15 million, that means depopulation from 52 million Ukraine had in 1992 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. depopulation started even before the war. Well, 10 million were basically lost by 2014, by the middle of the 2000s. The war accelerated depopulation. And then there is a question, if the countries, and that depopulation is actually even more extreme in comparison with other Eastern European countries, which also experienced the collapse of the state socialism, some pretty similar fundamental processes that led to the exodus of the population from the Baltic states in particular, from Poland as well, from the Western Balkans. But even in that comparison, Ukraine is extreme. So the question is, the war is basically destroying the capacity of the society to regenerate, right? And then to even if we make a stake, if we bet that, well, migrants from other countries would come to Ukraine and help to, well, to reconstruct the country, to give it some future, even that bet requires a lot of ifs, that a lot of investments, so that there must be jobs to actually attract people to the country. And those are very big ifs. Those are also assumptions about the European elites, about the national capital ready to invest into destroyed Ukraine. And another question is also, well, about that identity. If the war is about preserving identity, but at the same time we are destroying the capacity for regeneration of the society that carries that identity.
I'll just follow up a little bit, not on demographics as such, but the demographic decline is one aspect of what you call the peripherization of Ukraine. You mentioned it in connection with the relation to Poland, but it's perhaps even more pronounced in the relation to the West, now especially after the outbreak of the war, when the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian civil society have both become completely dependent on resources provided by the West. And I have studied political development in several African countries where I've seen this precise dynamic taking place. And it has very, I mean, one thing is whether you get the adequate amount of resources, but perhaps an even bigger problem is that it totally changes the nature of political representation and of political dynamics. Because instead of being accountable to your citizens and voters, both the state and civil society have to report to and be held accountable towards the donors. And that dynamic undermines the prospects of building both democracy and an effective state. But it's hard to see any alternative. It's hard to see any possible future where Ukraine will not be dependent, when this war ends, on economic resources from outside. So,
I mean, the even bigger problem is when the donors do not need that country anymore.
yeah,
And what happens to that?
yeah. I mean, whether they get, if they don't get any resources, that's a disaster. But if they get resources, that's deeply problematic as well.
It is.
At least, unless you get a strong form of socio-political mobilization within Ukraine, and at the same time you can have donors who allow the domestic political process to develop more organically in Ukraine. And from what you see, I mean, in countries across the world that have become dependent on donor funding,
And here, demography plays a crucial role, because in Africa there is a huge young population. The demographic pyramid is like this. In Ukraine, it's going to be like this.
Yeah, yeah, which makes the
That
situation even
undermines
much more
the
difficult.
capacity for internal social political mobilization.
Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on this question of foreign aid. One of my few sadistic pleasures is to ask donors what they mean when they talk about civil society. They always talk about civil society, and they get a bit confused when I ask them, and then it ends up with NGOs. And are NGOs part of civil society in a country that receives a lot of foreign aid, where NGOs are funded by these donors? I'm not so sure. And I wrote down a citation from Ivan Krastev, this famous Bulgarian political scientist, who wrote that the idea of civil society has long been a magical construct, one that has somehow succeeded in simultaneously satisfying modernization theorists' belief in the historical mission of the middle class, the New Left's fascination with spontaneous activism, neoliberals' affection for anti-statism, and Western donors' fondness for English-speaking NGOs. But today, that construct is losing its appeal. It's losing its appeal. He wrote it in year 2000. I'm not so sure if it's losing its appeal. It's still living, and it's being applied. And I think these NGOs are they are more like very clever people. They have nice attitudes. At least I think they have nice attitudes, because they tend to be very close to my kind of average Norwegian attitude to everything, middle of the tree. But they're clever, but they are representative only for a segment of the population. And still they are, we talked about that earlier, they are the go-to source of information for donors and for journalists, for NGOs. They are nice to speak, they are nice officers, they speak English fluently, sometimes German, sometimes French, sometimes French. You know, it's easy. But they are representatives of themselves, not of the entire society. So my question then is, how should we widen the contact surface with the Ukrainian society? And that goes back to what you said by way of introduction. And second question is, as you see it, what are the prospects for kind of genuine civil society in a Gramscian way, counter-hegemonic, for instance, in Ukraine, under the conditions of massive foreign support to NGOs, and also under the conditions of massive co-optation of all kinds of local activism. As soon as they occur, some NGOs or some foreign donors come and fund them, and then they start doing what Stein talked about, reporting upwards and not caring about their constituency. How to solve this problem?
Well, the part of the appeal that form of the civil society had has actually been deteriorated, and in particular because of the shutdown of the US aid, which has been actually particularly important for the Eastern European NGO sphere, and the impact of the shutdown by Trump has been visible and tangible. So that I would not underestimate those changes that are happening now in this sphere. The organizations are looking for other donors. Sometimes they find them. Sometimes they don't find them. Sometimes they need to downsize their projects and do other things. So there's some material change in the civil society, well, rather NGO sphere, is happening. well, potentially we could see this as a, well, as potential for opening the space for other groups if they had found their own resources. And this is actually difficult under the conditions of depopulation and under the, well, pretty extreme political developments that are pretty probable as a result of the war and the evolution of the political regime. Under the, speaking about the crisis of hegemony, it is particularly about the capacity of the society and politics to organize around common interests and not simply, well, organize for the privileged, rather elite groups from the middle class that then started to speak on behalf of the whole society. They do not actually represent, but for the capacity of the, well, regular working people to organize themselves and in the public sphere and also in politics. That capacity is only being more and more undermining, even despite that there is actually more and more need for the inclusion of organized workers into the politics in order actually to prevent certain disastrous developments. So in Ukraine, this is something that develops under pretty extreme conditions, and I'm quite pessimistic about that development. Of course, in principle, if you put some efforts and to go beyond the middle class English-speaking NGO sphere, you would find trade unions. They would be small, but yes, they would represent certain groups of workers. You would find grassroots groups. You would find informal volunteers who helped their neighbors during the war. You would find a number of the well, initiatives on the radar that are typically not well, in the discussion, in the communication with the Western scholars, journalists, and donors. But then whether they would actually have their capacity to represent themselves in the public sphere and make a political impact, this is something that would require a lot of other processes to allow and to make this possible. Interest from the West, from the, well, honest, progressive researchers is of course important in this development. But I think something more material also needs to happen to make well, kind of like real, genuine civil society possible in development, in particular in Ukraine. But this is, again, this is something that I believe is happening also in many other parts of the world, in Europe itself, where civil society is eroding. It has a bigger legacy, bigger unions, bigger history, strong organizations, strong institutions. But we also see that they are eroding, that less people participate in them, and they either become depoliticized, not involved in politics, or involving into the politics that we actually do not like.
We have spent a bit more than an hour. We have the room until 4 o'clock. So we should wind up pretty soon. But before we open the floor, I would like to ask you about in the incident or developments in Ukraine in the last couple of weeks about the politics of corruption and anti-corruption, and what you think that, how should that be interpreted, and what does it indicate about the near future political developments?
Well, we recently published an article about that, quite long one, with analysis of that conflict, which is published on Jacobin in English. So yeah, you may look at it, but in a few words. Well, on the one hand, we just It's been pretty ironic when the Western press started to discuss Zelensky as almost like a Putin, like explicitly comparing him to Putin, and well, discovering there is corruption in Ukraine, there is authoritarianism, well, there is like consolidation of power in the hands of Yermak, his chief of staff, kind of like Grey Cardinal, and then forgetting about like all that has been happening also during the war, but before the war in terms of the repression, in terms of the discrimination, and the things that have never been in the focus of well, Western public for some reason. But when something like when there is an attack on the anti-corruption institutions, which well also serve the interests of the transnational capital, and there are in our article we include very specific examples of that. Then, like a big scandal, authoritarianism in Ukraine. That's one thing. Another thing that actually the anti-corruption institutions in Ukraine have been actually unpopular. And we presented like a number of surveys conducted well, as late as 2024, showing that, well, for example, that the anti-corruption institutions are trusted even less than the security service of Ukraine. And the security service of Ukraine, which has been instrumental in that conflict, and when the head of the SBU was speaking in the on television that those detectives from the Anti-Corruption Bureau must be shot on sight when they come to, well, heroes of the war, which is pretty extreme, of course. But at the same time, well, according to the surveys, more people trust that the SBU actually wants to eradicate corruption than the anti-corruption institutions. And at the same time, the number of people who believe that the corruption became less in the last years is 5%. Mm-hmm. Almost 50% that think that it became worse. And so then this brings this conflict into a very different light than authoritarian Zelensky against good anti-corruption civil society. And well, my personal feeling about that is that actually it repeats the dynamics of Maidans, of the deficient revolutions that we've been actually mentioning. Those revolutions who actually not simply change nothing radical in the society, unlike social revolutions of the 1917 or 1789. Rapid fundamental changes of the whole class and state structure. Of course, they're not. But at the same time, they actually do have consequences. And those consequences is the weakening of power, delegitimating of power, more destabilization. And at the moment when Zelensky may be in the put into the forced to make very unpopular decisions about ending the war, well, whatever Trump decides about his support, whether Zelensky would be capable to get real guarantees from the EU, and so on. So the question of ceding territories may be back on the agenda. Or, on the other hand, maybe he would decide that the more efforts are needed to mobilize from the Ukrainian society, conscripting more soldiers. Both of these choices are very unpopular. And in the situation when the government needs to make a very unpopular decision, you actually need to have a strong and trusted government. And this exactly which has been recently undermined by this anti-corruption conflict. So, in brief, I'm pessimistic about it.
So my question is, you know, I was also surprised that this attempts by Zelensky to control the anti-corruption agencies came as a surprise to the journalists and so on, because it had been ongoing for a while. And it's kind of puzzling that Zelensky, who is totally dependent upon foreign donors, and foreign donors are extremely worried about Ukrainian corruption, perhaps too much worried about it, but still very worried about it, because of course they want their money to be spent on the purposes that they are meant to be spent on, and they are afraid of popular the popular opinion in their own countries, many European countries, not Norway, luckily, but countries like Germany, Poland, the popular support, or the whole idea of spending money on people in other countries is a bit strange and unpopular. But okay, they have accepted supporting Ukraine because it's a special situation. But it's waning. It's a kind of potential issue for right-wing populists to rally around anti-support, mobilizing on the unwillingness to support Ukraine. When it occurs that Ukraine is totally corrupt, and the authorities, our hero Zelensky, is trying to curb the activities of the anti-corruption agencies that we have believed in. You said that Ukrainians do not. I believe you. But still, it's a kind of puzzle. Why did he take this risk of provoking his donors? And I read in Ukrainska Pravda, there was an op-ed in Ukrainska Pravda, which is a typical outlet of the pro-Western NGO sector, that, okay, of course, Zelensky is used to getting away with everything in the European Union. They have turned their eyes. They have not protested when he has been attacking anti-corruption individuals, activists, and groups before. So he was a kind of hubris on his side, was their explanation. But it could also be a little bit like we have been talking about earlier, that this patrimonial, patronage-based system is so strong, it's the only way of running, or it's at least it seems to be the only way of running a country like Ukraine, like most countries in the world, actually. So, or is it, so is it just that he believed he could get away with it, or is it that this patrimonial system is eradicable, you can't get away with it, or was this more or less a kind of internal clash between the power, Zelensky and his group, and the opposition, the legal part of the opposition, which is the pro-Western NGO, urban middle-class groups in Ukraine. So these are my three hypotheses.
Well,
yeah,
there are many versions about that, and it's been discussed in Ukrainian analysts why exactly this happened. One of the dominant versions that anti-corruption institutions actually came for pretty close people to Zelensky, Mindich in particular. Yeah. Some of the people who know too much about that, and probably that provoked Zelensky's reaction. But what exactly happened, I think it's still early to say. One thing to remember is it was not only Zelensky, but Poroshenko before Zelensky was also sabotaging the development of the anti-corruption institutions, precisely because of the same interests. They do not want to have the independent, at least independent from them, oversight over the important economic and political flows in the country. So, like Zelensky later, Poroshenko before, was trying to slow down the certain critical decisions, in particular about the Anti-Corruption Bureau. He was also pressed very harshly by the EU, IMF, who ambassadors of the G7 countries who were starting to call him, threatening to suspend certain aid or suspend the decision about the visa-free regime in particular. IMF aid was conditioned upon the development of the anti-corruption institutions. Visa-free regime was conditioned on that. So that the anti-corruption policies, and we need to think about them a bit more critical than simply anti-corruption, they serve certain interests, and they threaten also certain interests within patrimonial political capitalist post-Soviet systems. That's why they formed this main conflict, at least how I view this. There is a real material conflict behind that, and different political elites in Ukraine, when they come to power, they do have stake in order to keep control over those pretty expensive anti-corruption institutions. So just to understand that anti-corruption institutions, it's, in Ukrainian case, is in project, this is basically a state within the state. It's a closed circuit, starting from the monitoring of the officials' lifestyle, to investigation, to prosecution, to special courts that must decide on the corruption cases. And this all kind of like separated from the regular prosecutors, from the regular detectives, from the regular courts, in order to prevent the influence of the local elites. In reality, it works very differently, but the idea is to build this kind of like independent from the local elites oversight over those local elites. The effectiveness of this, the real impact on the corruption situation and on the politics is very much challenged within Ukraine itself, and becomes kind of like a grievance for the local elites to mobilize against anti-corruption institutions, and not just close to Zelensky. For example, Yulia Tymoshenko, who was a very important politician since the late 1990s. She used to be the prime minister in Ukraine in 2000s. She used to be one of the main candidates for the president in 2010 elections when she lost to Yanukovych. And she, in this conflict, she very strongly supported Zelensky's decision to take control over the anti-corruption institutions and criticizing them as turning Ukraine into kind of like a disenfranchised colony. An interview with her was published in some of the mainstream big Western press recently, explaining her position. And she actually speaks, voices much more popular views among some significant sections of Ukrainian elites who are not happy about this, how the, well, so-called anti-corruption is developing. So.
Okay, thank you very much. We have now about 15 minutes or a bit less for some questions and comments from the audience. So, well, a number of hands. I'll start with Matthew.
Yes, Matthew Blackburn, NUPI. Thank you very much for that thought-provoking discussion. The question is about the 3 taboo points you made at the beginning in Ukrainian politics: neutrality, Soviet legacy, Ukraine as a bilingual country. I wonder how did you interpret Zelensky's 2019 election victory and the mandate that he received as a rejection of Poroshenko's pivot towards nationalism and conservatism? If you do see it that way, would you also be willing to evaluate how he has behaved as a political actor? He is rather beloved here in the West, and he is a very successful fundraiser, and he has been a very popular war leader in the West, but the view inside Ukraine probably is more mixed on his leadership. I wonder if you might say a few words about why he was unable to pursue what do you think his mandate was, and why he was unable to pursue the peace-related element of it, ultimately how it relates to the other points you've made today in your talk. Thank you.
Just before you reply, I would ask both Volodymyr now and the other people who asked questions to be brief, otherwise we'll just have time for 2 or 3.
I think you should collect the questions, otherwise.
Yeah, okay. Where was it again? Yeah, you? Annie?
Hi, Annie Yerman, also from this institute, researcher here. So many questions to choose among, but I would like to ask you how, of course, right now everything is about handling internationally kind of the West and its inactions, different priorities and so on, but how is grievances or views on the West and the different Western actors, kind of what's the discussion in Ukraine now, and could you speculate about the future, about how kind of the West will be seen and remembered in Ukraine?
We'll take 1 or 2 more. Are those you?
From It is my understanding that you support the idea that it's possible to base the struggle for social and historical progress on certain universal values. I share this optimistic view, and from what you have said today, I also think we have some values. We share some values in particular. But what confounds me is that you seem to think that the Soviet Union represented such values. I simply cannot understand how a one-party system dominated by great Russian chauvinism could possibly be seen as based on universal and progressive values. Is it not exactly this Soviet tradition that contributes significantly to the current problems in corruption and control by oligarchs or political parties? Have I understood you correctly? And if so, can you explain your way of thinking?
Do you want to respond briefly to these three? Then we take another round.
Yeah, probably. Okay, I'll do. Yeah, thank you for the questions. I really need to respond very briefly. To Matthew's question about Zelensky, it's a huge question, right? And what I want to say that, well, the vision in the West of Zelensky is changing, and we see this especially in the United States, but not only. Also in the press, in regards of the anti-corruption conflict. The view of Zelensky in Ukraine is also changing, and we also now understand how that conflict with the anti-corruption civil society revealed the shallowness of support for Zelensky. And it's actually that we can see in the public opinion surveys that also we conducted recently, the reason for the people who trust Zelensky, they explain that trust because first of all, he defends the country, and there is no other alternative. Two main reasons. That's it. That's not something that a leader who can actually offer any positive development for Ukraine, and that would be supported in that capacity as the leader who leads the country to the future. Just there is nobody else, and I interpret this as people basically are fearing of even more destabilization as a result of the if Zelensky would be removed or voted again, and so on. There's a lot of uncertainty about that. And this points to the whole problem with all that capacity for alternative development of Ukraine. There is a very basic asymmetry that has been probably replicated, that has existed since the 1990s. Certain view of Ukraine has much stronger civil political capacity. It does not mean they actually represent the majority. And in many points in time, their views have not been actually representative of the majority. Thinking about, for example, support for NATO until 2014, which was, well, very much supported among big section of the elites in the civil society, but within the population at large, NATO had support of at most 20%. Nevertheless, they decided to ask the NATO to include Ukraine on the eve of the Bucharest summit in 2008. But this objectively unpopular vision had stronger capacity to be represented in public sphere and to push forward this agenda in politics. And Zelensky didn't change that situation. Yes, he could be, he actually was elected as the rejection of the old elites. One reason. Another reason is rejection of the nationalist turn of Poroshenko, which gave Zelensky so strong support in the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine in the second round of the 2019 elections. But then it was a question how to actually was it possible to mobilize those grievances in the public sphere and in the politics? And the reality proved that the other camp has much stronger capacity to influence politics, or in particular via mobilization. And we had them in 2019 and then later, and especially after the full-scale invasion, which provided even more opportunities to push forward those agendas. Sometimes supported by the majority, sometimes not. So this is the question of that asymmetrical class conflict that I'm trying to analyze. The other question, how the West will be seen in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken about the last surveys, the support for Trump, for United States, which is associated with Trump, is going down in Ukraine. Support for EU is higher. Right? How it's going to develop would depend on the specific decisions. If EU is going to be seen as indecisive, incapable to support Ukraine, it may happen that the EU would be seen less and less. And, in principle, I would expect the further erosion of the European soft power in Eastern Europe, which is happening not just in Ukraine, not just because of the war, but because of the erosion of the European Union itself and its incapacity to offer the positive progressive development, at least at this moment. And the last question about the was the one-party system based on great Russian chauvinism, based on universal values? Actually, it did appeal to universal values. And it did have real support, not because it was ruled by communist apparatchiks, not because it was indeed some policies of Russification, but because there was something much more of other things that provided the material basis of the strong support for the regime within the country, but also internationally. The Soviet Union itself had strong strong soft power in many parts of the post-colonial world, and offered for massive movements and mobilizations and counter-elites the vision of alternative development. They were getting rid of the European metropolis, and at the same time, the Soviet Union provides a way of alternative model, which how it worked in Egypt, how it worked in Cuba, in Asian countries, and so on. So that hegemonic power which Soviet Union possessed, it was eroded as a result of the authoritarian system. It was eroded as a result of the stagnating economy, which was not capable to deliver what it had promised. But at the same time, there was something very important that the Soviet Union had. And now we understand even better when we actually miss it in post-Soviet countries, but also around the world. The legacies of the revolutions are reinterpreted with each generation. What was the Soviet Union, what was the Soviet Revolution was interpreted in one way in the 1920s, then in a different way in 1940s after the Second World War, at the peak of the Soviet power. And then in the 1990s, at the end of history, when it looked like totally failed experiment, and our countries are joining the road of civilization finally. And now it is reinterpreted in a very different way when we understand that the capitalism is in crisis, that liberal democracy is in crisis. And then the Soviets provided, even if, failed alternative, but still that was an alternative that for a certain period of time had a very substantial impact on the capacity for the democratic capitalist development, precisely because that alternative existed. And when it is missing, we are now in the crisis from which we do not have even any vision how to get out. And my belief is that the legacy of the Soviet Revolution will be reinterpreted once more in different ways. And the age of the social revolutions is probably has not ended yet.
We are actually out of time. So quite a few people here who had wanted to ask some questions, but the questions that were asked were so rather big and demanded some elaboration from Volodymyr. So I think we should be pleased for his elaborate answers, and then just accept the fact that we didn't have time for everybody to raise their questions. So I would just like to thank Volodymyr for his participation and for his willingness to come to NUPI and his very interesting comments and reflections. And also thank Jørn from Oslo Met University to help me in coordinating and organizing this conversation. Finally, thanks to everybody for showing up. I hope you think it was as interesting and stimulating as me. So thank you.
Thank you.